Hello whittlers and carvers, and welcome back to the joy of carving. It's a really fun project, this one. It's slightly more adept and advanced than past projects. There's one or two parts of this that are just quite tricky to carve because the pieces are so small, but I'll be guiding you through the whole process. And any questions you have, leave in the comments section. I'll do my best to answer them. So as always, grab yourself a cup of tea or a coffee and let's begin the joy of carving. If you've ordered the kit from the website, then you're going to receive the blank cutout, which is already roughed out, and the belly of the shark is where that small arch is here. If you're starting from scratch though and you're cutting this out of a larger piece of wood yourself, then I would suggest just making sure that the grain pattern is flowing horizontally along the shark to make it easier to carve. The first thing that we need to do is we need to remove some of this excess material. We need to have the blank of the shark a little bit more pointed. And there are actually two methods that we can utilize to do this. The first method is to whittle away the material that we don't need. Hold the blank firmly and carve away from yourself as if we were sharpening a pencil. But before we do that, we need to mark out the material that we need to remove. And this is our top view, our bird's eye view of the shark. So remember, the arch is where the belly is, and this is our bird's eye perspective of the shark. So it's going to be pointed at both ends and wider in the middle. Now the second method to remove that excess material would simply be to saw it away. You can use a bandsaw or a scroll saw if you're fortunate enough to own one of these, but if not, a normal hacksaw will do, because all we're doing is sawing the corners. But it's not a requirement to have a fancy machinery do it. We can simply just do this with a hacksaw, but the alternate method is the first one, and that's to just simply whittle away the excess material. Utilizing the saw method just saves us a little bit of time, really. Whichever method you use, you're going to end up with a piece that looks like this. And what I've done on mine is I've added a slight curve there just to give the finished carving a little bit more of a dynamic pose. It's going to look like the shark is sort of swishing its tail a bit through the water. You don't have to do this, but it will add a little bit of extra depth to your carving if you can put a slight curve into it. And we'll begin the carving just by taking all of those straight edges into a more cylindrical shape. So I'm carving away from myself, just pushing my thumb onto the back of the blade. So as I've said before in previous videos, this isn't a whole arm movement. We're relying on a sharp blade, and it's just a small movement carving away from ourselves here. The keen-eyed observers will notice that the shark doesn't have fins yet, and this is just because it's going to be far easier to carve everything separately. We can actually make whittling far more easier for ourselves if we consider pieces that can be carved separately and attached later on. So it's much easier to round the overall shape of the shark without the fins in place yet. The first challenging part about this particular whittling is the tail. So we'll need to change the direction in which we're carving here. If we just carved straight down towards the tail, so if I just carved like this and carried on, what would happen is I would chip off a large piece of the tail. So you actually need to stop when you get to the tail, change angle and carry on whittling. So really consider how the flow of the wood grain affects the carving. And you can see there that I'm stopping before I get to the tail. And I've mentioned on other videos as well, we always want to carve downhill, because if we try and carve uphill, if we try and carve the wood upwards, what it's going to do is it's going to lift the grain pattern and just tear the wood instead of carving it. As you carve the piece, really try to consider the thickness of the tail. Make sure that you're not going too thin. And you can see that I'm carving towards myself there, but I am using a thumb sheath just to protect my thumb from the blade. But you don't have to use this method. You can reverse it and carve away from yourself like we did when we were carving the body of the shark. The key to carving the tail is to just take your time. Just keep taking away very small pieces and really try to feel how the wood feels as you're carving it. Is the wood tearing or is it carving? If it's tearing, you need to change the direction in which you're carving, reverse it and carve in the opposite direction. If you pay attention to how the wood feels, then it's very good at telling you if you're carving in the wrong direction. And you can see that the tail is almost finished there. So we finished one side, we just need to reverse it and repeat the process on the other side. All I'm doing now, just to give the tail a little bit more definition, is I'm just carving an angle, a little groove into where the tail meets the fin. And it's really simple to do. We just carve at an angle and then reverse it and do the exact same on the opposite side. And you're left with a kind of V-shaped groove. And there's the finished body of the shark with that tail completed. So now we can move on to the fins. So now we're carving the fins, and these are very small pieces. So you are going to need to use some sort of hand protection, thumb sheaths or gloves to just help protect your hands as you're carving these. But for the purpose of the video, I'm not going to put mine on, just so that you can see exactly how I'm carving. I don't want to block that carving in any way. But you also don't necessarily have to hold the pieces like this. Another way to carve them is to hold them firmly on the worktop and just whittle away the edges, because these are in fact really simple pieces to carve. All we're really doing is thinning them down and rounding the edges. We don't need to add any further detail to them. Another technique that you could use to carve these would be to, prior to cutting them out, actually leave them attached to a longer piece of material so that you've got more of a handle to hold on to when you're carving them. You could also, if you've already cut these out, you could glue them onto a scrap piece of stock so that you've got more of a handle again, just to give you a bit of extra stability as you're carving them. But as I said, these aren't particularly complex to carve. All we're doing is just rounding the edges and thinning the stock down, so these won't take very long to do. And there's one of the finished fins, so now we can carve the others in the exact same way, and when you're done we can glue them onto the shark. I recommend using wood glue because it will be the strongest type of glue to use for this. And you can make that joint, that glue hold even stronger if you flatten out the surface slightly prior to gluing the fins in place. So I'm just marking out where I want the top fin to be and then using the whittling knife to just flatten that area. It's just going to provide a flat surface for the fin to be glued to, so it'll be a much stronger hold. Now we get to carve the chompers, the mouth of the shark. Start just by marking out and drawing onto the piece where you want the mouth to be. Start by using the tip or the edge of the knife to just gently score that pencil line in. Really gently here. You don't need much force at all and you don't want to risk slipping here. We're just gently scoring the line in. And what that scored line has done, it's provided us with a stopping cut. So you can see there what I'm doing is I'm pressing the knife blade in, then I'm going in the opposite direction and carving into the line. And just repeating that process all the way around the mouth. So pressing the knife into the scored line, carving in the opposite direction towards the line. And again, just repeat that process until you have the depth that you want for the mouth. And after a little bit of patience and whittling, you'll end up with the finished mouth. Once the mouth is carved, we can glue the remaining fins and then start to add the final details, so the gill and the eyes. So just pencil in where you want those to be, and we'll use the exact same technique that we used to carve the mouth with the gills. So we're just going to scoring those lines and then carve into the lines to create a small impression. And the eyes are even easier to carve. We're just going to use the tip of the knife to just gently twist it in place, just to create the impression, a small dent where the eye will be. And the seaweed is really simple to carve, so there's no real wrong way of doing this. All we need to do is just round all of the edges and just thin the material down. And we'll finish the seaweed just by sharpening the very bottom of it. So we're carving that into a point, and that's so that it'll fit into the hole we've made for the base. The very last thing that we need to do is to simply glue the shark to the seaweed that we've just carved, and that's the finished piece. I absolutely loved carving this project. I think it was such a fun subject to carve. I hope you enjoyed the video and that it was useful for you. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been supportive on the channel, who subscribed and left such nice comments, and thanks for the thumbs ups and the clicks. It's really, really appreciated. Thank you so much, everyone. So until the next video, happy carvings, everyone.